4. That was the number that hung over the room before anyone formally acknowledged it. 4 American service members dead. The cameras were already live. The microphones were already hot. But for a brief moment, there was something heavier than noise. A pause that felt intentional. This was not a routine policy briefing. This was not a ceremonial appearance. This was a confrontation that had been building for days, not inside Congress, but across state lines. At one podium stood Donald Trump, defending a military operation he described as necessary, decisive, and protective of American interests. At the other stood Gavin Newsom, not as a member of Congress, not invoking federal procedure, but as the governor of the largest state economy in the country, a state already feeling the tremors of global instability. This wasn't about decor, but decor had entered the narrative. In the days following the operation, a widely circulated clip showed the president speaking at length about renovations inside the White House, a ballroom, new drapery, aesthetic upgrades described with precision. Under normal circumstances, such remarks would have passed as background detail. These were not normal circumstances, because at the same time, oil markets were reacting. For every $10 increase per barrel of crude, analysts estimated roughly a 24-cent increase per gallon at the pump. In California, where gas prices already tend to run higher than the national average, that difference is not abstract. It shows up on highway exit signs. It shows up in weekly budgets. It shows up in voter frustration. Governor Newsom stepped forward not to debate military tactics, but to question consequence. California is already preparing for emergency contingencies we weren't discussing a week ago, he said evenly. Energy volatility, supply chain strain, escalation risk. He did not accuse. He did not claim illegality. But he framed the stakes in terms that resonated at the state level. Because when global oil prices climb, California ports feel it. When markets dip, pension funds notice. When instability spreads across regions connected to American trade, West Coast economies absorb the ripple. The president remained firm. He reiterated that leadership sometimes requires acting before Congress can fully convene. That strength deters aggression. That waiting can be more dangerous than moving. He spoke about national security, about protecting American lives, about restoring deterrence. The exchange was not theatrical. There was no shouting, but the contrast was unmistakable. The president spoke in the language of power projection. The governor spoke in the language of impact. Mr. President, Newsom continued, we've had to convene emergency planning conversations this week that we didn't have to have before. Cities, counties, our Office of Emergency Services. It was a small detail, but it carried weight. Because emergency planning is not political theater, it is logistical reality. And in California, a state prone to wildfires, earthquakes, and rolling blackouts, emergency readiness is not a metaphor, it is muscle memory. The president pivoted back to necessity, to intelligence briefings, to the urgency of preventing broader threats. He did not concede miscalculation. He did not soften his defense. But the room sensed something emerging, a subtle misalignment. Governor Newsom wasn't questioning whether the president had authority to act. He was questioning whether the downstream impact had been fully considered. Every $10 spike in oil, Newsom said, means roughly 24 cents more per gallon for working families, for small businesses, for truckers moving goods through our ports. He let the math linger. In a state of nearly 40 million people, 24 cents per gallon is not just a statistic, it multiplies. The president responded by pointing to long-term strength, to economic resilience, to the argument that decisive action now prevents higher costs later. Two frameworks, two lenses, neither inherently unlawful, but operating on different timelines. Newsom then touched the point that had become unavoidable. 4 service members lost their lives, he said, and Californians want clarity about the objective, about what marks success, about what prevents escalation. Not an accusation, a request. The president reiterated deterrence, strength, protection. But specifics about duration, defined milestones, or a publicly articulated endgame remained broad. Outside the room, markets were fluctuating. Crypto had dipped sharply. Energy analysts were recalibrating forecasts. Gulf allies were issuing cautious statements. Inside the room, the tension remained controlled, but undeniable. Because this wasn't simply a policy disagreement, it was a clash of jurisdiction. Federal authority versus state consequence. Executive action versus economic absorption. The governor of California was not claiming power over foreign policy. He was asserting responsibility for what happens when foreign policy hits Main Street. The president did not yield ground. He emphasized that America must act from strength. That hesitation invites instability. That leadership cannot always wait for perfect consensus. The governor did not retreat either. He emphasized affordability. Emergency preparedness. The burden on families who already feel stretched. The shift in the room was subtle but real. This was no longer about a ballroom comment. It was about priority, about sequencing, about whether decisive military action and domestic economic stability can move in lockstep, or whether one inevitably pressures the other. Neither man declared victory, neither conceded error. But something important had begun. Because once a governor of the largest state economy publicly links federal military action to gas prices, emergency readiness, and affordability pressures, the debate expands beyond Washington. And once that happens, it doesn't stay contained to one hearing room. It spreads. And the real confrontation was only beginning. The shock was not just the number, it was the sequence. 4 American service members dead, energy prices rising across global markets within hours, American aircraft reportedly taking fire in contested airspace. And a growing question, not shouted, not dramatized, but steadily building. What exactly is the endgame? At the center of it stood Donald Trump, defending a military operation he framed as necessary and protective of American interests. Opposite him stood Gavin Newsom, not claiming authority over foreign policy, but asserting responsibility for the consequences when global instability reaches California's coast. This was no longer about decor. It was about direction. Governor Newsom did not open with outrage. He opened with impact. In the last 72 hours, he said, California has had emergency preparedness conversations we weren't having before. Not rhetoric, logistics. California's Office of Emergency Services had reviewed contingency protocols. Cities had discussed supply chain vulnerabilities. Energy officials had recalibrated projections. Because when oil markets move, California feels it first, and often harder. For every $10 increase in a barrel of crude, analysts estimate roughly a 24-cent increase per gallon at the pump. In a state where gas prices already exceed the national average, that difference compounds quickly. A driver commuting 40 miles a day notices. A trucking company running a fleet notices. A family calculating grocery costs notices. The governor wasn't accusing the president of causing global oil volatility single-handedly. He was highlighting timing. The operation was announced. Markets reacted. Gas ticked upward. And California began planning for strain. President Trump responded firmly. He emphasized deterrence, strength, prevention. He argued that decisive action now avoids greater instability later. He did not concede that economic volatility necessarily follows military action. He framed the decision as one of national security, not market speculation. But Newsom's argument operated on a different axis. Californians are struggling with affordability, he said. Food costs, housing, insurance, energy. He didn't connect every dot explicitly. He didn't declare causation, but he asked whether escalation abroad was being weighed against pressure at home. The room tightened again, because this was no longer theoretical. 4 service members were dead, and their deaths were linked to an operation the president described as urgent. Newsom approached carefully. Mr. President, he said, has a clear objective been articulated to the American people? What marks success? What prevents further escalation? The president reiterated national security priorities. He referenced intelligence assessments. He spoke of restoring deterrence and protecting American lives, but the phrase defined endgame remained elusive. Not denied, not detailed, simply broad. That gap, between urgency and specificity, became the silent center of the exchange. Meanwhile, financial markets were reacting in real time. Major indexes had dipped. Crypto markets experienced sharp declines. Energy analysts were warning of sustained upward pressure if tensions widened. Again, none of these movements proved miscalculation. Markets react to uncertainty, and uncertainty alone can drive volatility. But uncertainty was now measurable. Newsom shifted slightly. "We are also seeing strain among Gulf partners," he said. "Reports of aircraft incidents, reports of crossfire." He did not assert fault. He did not frame it as failure. He framed it as risk, because California's economy is deeply integrated into global trade routes. Ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach move goods that connect directly to regions affected by geopolitical instability. If shipping slows, California feels it. If insurance rates spike, California feels it. If escalation broadens, California absorbs secondary shock. President Trump remained resolute. He argued that American strength stabilizes global systems in the long term. That hesitation emboldens adversaries. That action, even controversial action, restores clarity. Two frameworks again: strength versus stability, speed versus consultation, national authority versus state absorption. Newsom then approached the most sensitive terrain, not in accusation, but in implication. "There has been discussion," he said evenly, "about whether Congress formally authorized this action." He did not accuse the president of bypassing Congress. He acknowledged executive authority exists in matters of national defense, but he asked whether broader alignment might have reduced uncertainty, both domestically and globally. The president responded that consultations had occurred, that briefings were provided, that the administration acted within constitutional authority. No admission of overreach, no suggestion of impropriety, but the distinction between consultation and authorization lingered. And in high-stakes geopolitical environments, those distinctions matter. Newsom did not press further on legality. Instead, he returned to consequence. "4 families," he said quietly, "are receiving news tonight." The room stilled. He did not politicize the loss. He did not attribute blame. He simply acknowledged weight. And Californians want clarity, not just about why this action occurred, but about what comes next. That question, what comes next, echoed beyond the hearing room. Because escalation is not a single event, it is a series of decisions, and once initiated, it carries momentum. President Trump emphasized that strength prevents further loss, that the operation was calibrated, that the United States does not act without reason. But details remained measured. Specific intelligence justifications were not disclosed. Timelines were not pinned down. Milestones were not enumerated. The governor's posture remained controlled. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse the president of recklessness. But he highlighted a tension that extended beyond California. If markets continue to react, he said, if energy continues to climb, if emergency services remain on elevated readiness, that has downstream consequences, not predictions, possibilities. And that distinction mattered. The confrontation had not yet exploded. It was building. Because neither man had conceded ground, the president framed the moment as necessary strength in defense of national interests. The governor framed it as a cascading set of economic and logistical consequences that required clarity. Both acknowledged risk. Both claimed responsibility from different angles. But the unresolved variable remained the same. What is the defined objective, and how long does it last? Without that clarity, uncertainty persists, and uncertainty in global markets and geopolitical environments rarely remains contained. The hearing did not end in resolution. It did not descend into chaos, but it crossed a threshold. Because once a governor publicly ties a federal military action to gas prices, emergency planning, market volatility, and affordability strain, the conversation expands beyond defense. It becomes economic. It becomes domestic. It becomes personal. And that expansion sets the stage for something larger than a single exchange. It sets the stage for a reckoning over how power is exercised and how consequences are managed. The high point had not yet arrived, but the fault lines were fully visible, and neither side appeared ready to step back. 4. That number had not disappeared. It sat beneath every sentence, beneath every exchange, beneath every pause between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom. 4 American service members dead. That fact did not shift depending on framing. It did not rise or fall with market volatility. It did not respond to political messaging. It remained constant. What was not constant was the interpretation of what followed. The president continued to defend the operation as necessary, decisive, calibrated. He emphasized urgency. He emphasized protection. He emphasized that hesitation in moments of threat can cost more lives than action ever will. That argument carries historical weight. Presidents are not elected to hesitate when intelligence signals danger. They are elected to decide. And decisiveness in moments of uncertainty can project strength outward. But projection is not the same as explanation, and that is where the governor kept applying pressure, not through accusation but through inquiry. What precisely was the imminent threat? Was it specific? Was it measurable? Was there a defined window that would have closed had the United States waited for broader alignment? The president spoke of intelligence assessments. He spoke of risk prevention. He spoke of deterrence. But deterrence is an outcome, not a timeline. It is a strategy, not a milestone. If deterrence is the objective, how is it measured? By absence of retaliation, by silence from adversaries, by stability in the region? And how long does that measurement period last? While those questions lingered, oil markets moved. Energy futures do not wait for clarity. For every $10 increase in crude, roughly 24 cents per gallon moves at the pump. In California, that shift compounds quickly. A commuter driving 40 or 50 miles a day feels it by the end of the week. A trucking fleet feels it by the end of the month. Multiply that across nearly 40 million residents, and the effect becomes less theoretical and more tangible. The governor did not claim the president single-handedly caused the increase. Global markets are more complex than a single action. But he asked whether the potential economic ripple had been factored in alongside the military calculus. Is short-term volatility an acceptable price for long-term security? Perhaps, but what if volatility is not short-term? What if markets interpret escalation as sustained tension rather than contained action? What if insurance premiums on shipping routes rise? What if allies hesitate in coordination? The president insisted the move was controlled, measured, and necessary to prevent larger instability. That may prove correct, but markets operate on perception, and perception thrives in uncertainty. Without a defined endgame, investors imagine worst-case scenarios before they imagine best-case outcomes. Then there was the symbolic contrast that refused to fade. A widely circulated clip of the president describing White House renovations, ballroom upgrades, curtains, aesthetics. Under normal circumstances, that would have been trivial. Leaders speak about infrastructure improvements all the time. Governance does not pause for single-issue focus. Yet context alters weight. 4 service members dead. Markets unsettled. Energy climbing. And the most replayed segment involved decor. Was it unfair editing? Was it bad timing? Or did it suggest misplaced emphasis? The governor did not accuse. He simply observed that symbolism matters. In moments of national loss, optics become magnified. Leadership is not just about what is done, but about what is emphasized. The conversation edged toward authority. Was Congress fully aligned? Were consultations equivalent to authorization? The president maintained that briefings occurred, that executive authority allows swift defensive action. Legally, presidents possess such authority in limited circumstances, but would formal congressional backing have steadied markets? Would bipartisan endorsement have signaled unity to allies and adversaries alike? Or would delay have weakened deterrence and emboldened opposition? History provides examples supporting both interpretations. Swift action has prevented escalation in some cases. In others, it has widened it. The uncertainty lies not in precedent, but in prediction. Reports of regional strain compounded the tension. Gulf allies navigating instability. American aircraft encountering resistance. None of it conclusively proved spiral escalation, but escalation rarely announces itself with clarity at the outset. It accumulates through incremental reactions. One action prompts a response. A response prompts reinforcement. Reinforcement prompts miscalculation. The governor's questions were framed around guardrails. What limits exist? What triggers withdrawal? What benchmarks define mission accomplished? The president's responses emphasized strength and prevention. Yet strength without articulated boundaries can be interpreted in multiple ways. Domestic affordability hovered beneath every exchange. Food assistance debates, Medicaid discussions, tax policy conflicts. The governor did not conflate these with the military action directly, but he juxtaposed them. If fiscal restraint is invoked in domestic programs, how are new military commitments reconciled? The president argued that national security supersedes budget hesitation. That argument resonates in principle. Security underpins economic prosperity. But if security action introduces prolonged economic strain, the balance becomes more complex. What if gas remains elevated for months? What if supply chains tighten? What if inflationary pressures resurface? These are not accusations, they are contingencies. Civilian casualty reports surfaced in broader media cycles, though details remained fluid. The governor approached the topic cautiously. Verification, investigation, accountability. Modern conflicts unfold in real time on digital platforms. Images circulate before official briefings conclude. Public perception forms rapidly. The president reiterated that operations were precise, that intelligence was credible. Precision in warfare is the objective. Yet the fog of conflict complicates certainty. If unintended harm occurred, how would it be addressed? Transparency reassures. Ambiguity unsettles. The underlying clash was philosophical as much as procedural. The president framed leadership as decisive strength in the face of risk. The governor framed leadership as managing downstream consequence in the face of uncertainty. Speed versus alignment. Authority versus absorption. Neither position inherently invalid, both rooted in legitimate responsibilities. But when those frameworks intersect, friction forms. And friction invites scrutiny. Public trust does not require unanimous agreement. It requires comprehension. If Americans understand the objective, they can debate its wisdom. If the objective remains broad, deterrence, stability, protection, without measurable endpoints, speculation fills the void. How long does deterrence last? What defines stability? What threshold marks completion? Without specificity, duration becomes elastic. Elastic commitments unsettle investors, allies, and families alike. Markets operate on psychology. If traders believe escalation is contained, volatility fades. If they fear expansion, capital retreats. Similarly, if drivers believe gas spikes are temporary, frustration is muted. If they anticipate sustained tension, behavior shifts. Clarity reduces anxiety. Ambiguity magnifies it. The governor's recurring inquiry centered on prevention of expansion. What prevents the next step? What prevents retaliation from widening the theater? The president's assurance was confidence. This action restores deterrence. Confidence can steady nerves. But confidence without detail can also invite skepticism. The exchange intensified not through raised voices, but through layered questions. Endgame, timeline, economic insulation, allied coordination, civilian safeguards. Each returned with slight variation. The president did not retreat. He did not concede error. But repetition exposed the space between assertion and articulation. That space is where debate thrives. Comparisons to past conflicts hovered unspoken. Some leaders acted swiftly and were vindicated by history. Others acted swiftly and were second-guessed by hindsight. Some delayed and were criticized for weakness. Others delayed and avoided catastrophe. The present offers no hindsight. It offers only probability and interpretation. Which trajectory this operation follows remains undetermined. That indeterminacy fuels both defense and doubt. 4 service members remain at the center. Their loss anchors the seriousness of the moment. Energy volatility underscores the economic stakes. Market fluctuation reflects global sensitivity. A governor warns of downstream impact. A president defends decisive authority. Neither yields. Neither escalates beyond composure. Yet the pressure rises because the central question remains unresolved. What is the defined objective, and how will Americans recognize its achievement? Without that clarity, speculation persists, and speculation in geopolitics rarely stays confined. It influences investment decisions. It shapes allied posture. It colors domestic political narrative. The confrontation evolves from a policy disagreement into a broader referendum on how power is exercised under uncertainty. Leadership under pressure reveals not only decision-making capacity, but explanatory depth. Is speed the ultimate virtue in crisis, or is alignment the stabilizing force? Does decisive projection prevent escalation, or risk provoking it? Does economic volatility represent temporary adjustment or early warning? These are not accusations. They are live questions. And as the exchange continued, the air in the room thickened. Not with outrage, but with expectation. Because strength must eventually meet specificity. Authority must eventually meet articulation. And the American public, watching gas prices tick upward and markets sway, will weigh confidence against clarity. The answers have not yet crystallized. The crest has not yet broken. But the tension, economic, strategic, symbolic, continues to build. The hearing ended without applause. There was no dramatic walkout, no final exchange sharp enough to echo through the chamber. Instead, it concluded the way consequential moments often do, quietly, almost clinically, with binders closing, microphones dimming, and staffers already drafting statements before the principals had fully left the room. But outside that room, the aftermath moved quickly. Within minutes, cable news split the exchange into competing narratives. One network framed Donald Trump as decisive under pressure, a commander willing to act swiftly in defense of American interests despite political noise. Another highlighted the questions posed by a Gavin Newsom, emphasizing the absence of a clearly articulated endgame and the economic ripple already visible in energy markets. Neither side claimed legal violation. Neither side used the word unlawful, but tone replaced terminology. Commentators replayed the clip about the ballroom renovation alongside the mention of 4 fallen service members, not to assert wrongdoing, but to underscore contrast. Optics became shorthand for priority. Analysts debated whether the juxtaposition was fair or politically opportunistic. The clip did not disappear. It multiplied. On social media, the split hardened. Supporters of the president posted variations of a familiar defense. Decisive leadership requires confidence, and governance involves multiple issues at once. Critics circulated edited excerpts focusing exclusively on the unresolved question. What precisely defines success in this operation? Hashtags formed around 2 competing ideas, strength versus transparency. Energy price charts began appearing alongside screenshots from the hearing. Users calculated 24 cents per gallon against average commute distances. Others pointed out that global oil markets respond to dozens of variables, not a single policy action. Facts were not disputed. Interpretations were. Meanwhile, within political circles, allies of the president emphasized constitutional authority. They reminded reporters that executive power in matters of national defense has precedent. They noted that consultations with congressional leadership occurred, even if formal authorization was not explicitly invoked in advance. They framed the governor's questions as political positioning from a state executive without jurisdiction over foreign policy. Allies of the governor took a different angle. They emphasized not legality, but clarity. They pointed out that asking for a defined objective does not equate to accusing misconduct. They argued that markets, allies, and families deserve measurable benchmarks when lives are on the line. Donors and major stakeholders watched carefully. Financial backers aligned with the president signaled continued support, underscoring stability and projecting confidence in the administration's handling of national security. Corporate leaders, however, began quietly asking about energy projections and long-term exposure. Publicly, statements remained measured. Privately, contingency discussions expanded. Within California, emergency planning conversations continued. State agencies monitored fuel inventories and trade flow. The governor's office did not escalate rhetoric. It maintained a posture of preparedness. That restraint, for some observers, added weight to the original inquiry. The absence of outrage made the questions harder to dismiss. The president's public appearances in the days following the hearing shifted subtly, not dramatically, but noticeably. References to strength remained central. Mentions of economic resilience increased. Language around the operation included more emphasis on calibration and containment. Still, the phrase "defined endgame" did not appear in any structured outline. That omission became the story, not because it proved error, but because it left space. In politics, space invites narrative. Editorial boards across major newspapers published diverging perspectives. Some argued that demanding excessive detail during active operations risks signaling strategy to adversaries. Others argued that withholding clear benchmarks risks eroding public trust. The most disciplined commentary avoided extremes. It acknowledged the president's constitutional authority while noting the governor's point about cascading domestic impact. It recognized that action in geopolitics carries cost, but that cost alone does not prove misjudgment. And yet, the central question persisted, not shouted, not dramatized, simply repeated: what marks completion? Without an articulated endpoint, duration becomes elastic. Elastic commitments complicate markets. They complicate alliances. They complicate public patience. Polls conducted in the days after the hearing reflected nuance rather than polarization. A majority supported protecting American interests abroad. A slightly smaller majority wanted clearer explanation of objectives. The overlap was significant. Americans were not choosing between strength and transparency. They were asking whether both could coexist. Inside Washington, congressional leaders debated procedural responses. Some called for formal authorization votes to clarify alignment. Others warned that such moves could signal division during sensitive operations. The debate was procedural, not accusatory. But the very fact that it continued underscored unresolved tension. Internationally, allies issued carefully worded statements affirming partnership while encouraging de-escalation. No ally formally broke ranks. None openly criticized the action. But diplomatic language shifted from endorsement to caution. Words like monitoring and coordination appeared more frequently in official communications. Back home, the atmosphere around the president did not collapse. It tightened. Press conferences became more structured, questions more pointed, answers more deliberate. There was no admission of miscalculation, no retreat from authority. But the cadence slowed. The tone sharpened. Around the governor, the atmosphere changed as well. He was no longer speaking solely as a state executive managing domestic concerns. He had positioned himself, intentionally or not, as a voice articulating the domestic implications of federal power. That elevated his profile. It also heightened scrutiny of his own preparedness metrics and economic projections. Neither man emerged weakened in an obvious sense. Neither emerged strengthened without qualification. Instead, the exchange altered the frame. Before the hearing, the story was the operation itself. After the hearing, the story became explanation. The difference is subtle but significant. Military action can dominate headlines for days. Questions about objective can linger for weeks. And in that lingering space, public perception shifts not through dramatic revelations, but through accumulation. Accumulation of unanswered details. Accumulation of rising prices or stabilizing ones. Accumulation of allied statements. Accumulation of time. Because time tests narratives. If markets stabilize and tensions cool, decisive strength becomes the prevailing interpretation. If volatility persists and objectives remain undefined, calls for transparency intensify. At no point in the hearing was illegality declared. No formal accusation was substantiated. No ruling was issued. Authority was asserted. Questions were posed. Gaps remained. The most striking consequence was not outrage. It was ambiguity. Ambiguity about duration. Ambiguity about measurement. Ambiguity about whether silence on certain details reflects prudence or evasion. And ambiguity, in matters of war and economy, carries its own gravity. The four service members remain at the center of the story, though their names have not been politicized. Their loss anchors the seriousness of the debate. Around that anchor swirl competing interpretations of leadership, restraint, and responsibility. The hearing did not determine guilt. It did not deliver resolution. It did something quieter. It crystallized the central question without resolving it. What does the public deserve in moments like this? Reassurance or specificity? Is it enough for an action to be within the bounds of authority, or must it also withstand the scrutiny of transparency? At what point does not unlawful diverge from not wrong? And when clarity is withheld in the name of strength, does that protect public trust or slowly erode it? If questions like that matter to you, subscribe.